Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our conversation to follow the film Trust Me. I am so thrilled to have this great panel of people joining me to have this conversation and really focus on how these issues that we just watched in the film really relate to the issue of teen wellness and teen mental health. I'd love to introduce our great panel, starting with the director of the film, Roko Belic. Welcome, Roko.
Thank you.
And Michelle Ciulla Lipkin, who is the executive director of the National Association for Media Literacy Education, AKA NAMLE. Hi, Michelle. Dr. Robert Lustig, who is a neuroendocrinologist and professor from UCSF. Welcome, Dr. Lustig. And Kalina Kula, a high school senior from High School 1327 in San Rafael, California. Thank you and welcome to Kalina. And Kalina will actually be sort of co-moderating with me and addressing some questions directly to the panelists as a wonderful representative of the teen community here in Marin. And I'd like to kick off first, just maybe with Roko, if you could just tell us a little bit about your motivation for making this film and what you saw kind of just even, if I can, you know, as a layperson in seeing the need for this film and why you chose to essentially to craft it the way that you did and where you saw the issues of urgency.
Sure. The film wasn't my idea. A guy named Joe Phelps, who has an organization called the Getting Better Foundation, called me basically out of the blue because he had seen another film I made and said he wanted to make a movie exploring information and misinformation. And it was something that had been on my mind because I have two children who are growing up in the modern school system. They've been issued, at least my daughter was in second grade at the time, she had been issued a laptop computer. And I realized that the controls that the teacher thought were on my daughter's computer to limit the access she had to things that were, let's say, inappropriate, were not there. There was a disconnect between the teacher who had been around, you know, been doing her thing for 30 or 40 years, and the modern challenges that teachers face these days with technology. So it was something that was interesting, that I've already been interested in. And I thought, oh, what a great excuse. I have an excuse to spend, you know, a few months or a year finding out what are the issues that we're facing, what are the challenges, and what are what's the fallout from this being a kind of a Wild West space still, in the sense that the internet is largely unregulated and the way people use it is, you know, we have access to things we never did before. And I wanted to explore that. So that's the genesis. What I realized very quickly by coming across people like Michelle Ciulla Lipkin and NAMLE and organizations that had been teaching media literacy for literally decades is that this is not a new issue. You know, media literacy is something that has been important ever since media existed. You know, lies have existed as long as people have been able to speak, and discerning what is true and discerning people's intentions has been important since the beginning of communication. So I realized there was a broader context that was also enjoyable for me as a creative person to explore. So we reached out to experts, and then we wanted to find out human stories that really illustrated why these concepts were important. You know, what happens when a parent gets misinformation about medicines, for example, or vaccines? What happens when a community in a small village hears misinformation about kidnappers being in the area? You know, these all have side effects that were much more dramatic than I thought I would encounter. But when I did, I realized they had to be in the film, because that's really what's at stake. It's, in many cases, it's a life or death situation, you know, whether somebody is media literate or not.
Right, very powerful. So since obviously we're presenting this as part of our teen wellness film series, I really want to, you know, focus on that concept of teen wellness and explore the impact of media consumption, media addiction, media literacy on teen mental health. So Michelle and Robert, can you maybe each talk a little bit about the impact that, what that looks like from your areas of expertise, and maybe just give us a little background on the work you've been, you know, maybe Michelle, we can start with you on your work with media literacy and you know, how we see, how you've been working on how we counter the negative impacts that the film explored. So Roko did such a good job with.
Sure. So I lead NAMLE, and we're a national organization that is committed to seeing media literacy be highly valued and widely practiced as a 21st century essential skill. And so really, when it comes to teens, what we are really looking at is ensuring that teens and all of those that go through the formal education system in the US have the skills that they need to thrive in the world that they're going to work in and lead. And media literacy is key to that. We have a strong belief that in order to be a fully participating citizen in today's world, you need media literacy skills. And without that, you're really lacking the ability to truly get involved and truly understand the world. And what is so great about teens and civic engagement is that it goes really well with what their instincts already are. So from our perspective, it's ensuring that when students graduate high school, they have skills. And certainly these skills are not something that are ever going to, you're going to get to that point where you're media literate. You always have to be working and thinking about this. And so we want to ensure that even beyond formal education that we're thinking about this. But ultimately, we want to make sure that we're having really important conversations and asking really important questions in high school classrooms all over.
So Robert, tell us a little bit about your background, your experience, and how you're making the connections from, sort of a biological and psychological perspective around media.
Right. So I'm a pediatric endocrinologist. I've been taking care of kids for 40 years. The one thing that is, evident is that if you're going to end up with a psychiatric disease, you're going to basically manifest it during puberty, during adolescence. Schizophrenia, depression, impulse control disorders, etc., all occur during the teenage years. And there's a reason for that. It has to do with the development of the brain, has to do with the myelinization, that is the laying down of the fats that coat neurons to protect them. Bottom line is that neurons during adolescence are actually more susceptible to damage. And they're more susceptible to chemical damage from, for instance, street drugs. And they're also more susceptible to cortisol, that is the stress hormone that comes out, in the fear response. We now know that these social media sites, internet gaming, et cetera, are basically driving two phenomena: dopamine, that is reward, and cortisol, that is fear, reward and fear. And what they're doing is they're actually changing the synaptic architecture of the brain. And teens are the most susceptible to it. So basically, we have to protect teens more even than the general population. And you've seen over the last year how the general population fares when being bombarded with reward and stress. So you can imagine how teens are faring in this climate as well.
Well, so then I wonder, just from that perspective, is there a way that teens have any sort of advantage as far as, particularly around like confirmation bias, as far as the fact that they've had less time to be carrying certain perspectives and ideas and biases that adults maybe have had for way longer? Is that something that they're able to, is there, I guess I'm saying, is there a positive side of that as far as the way that they are processing some of this information? Well,
so there are two ways to think. There's deliberative thinking and there's intuitive thinking. And, you can call it, analytical or gut thinking. And the fact of the matter is that deliberative thinking requires an area of the brain right here in the front called the prefrontal cortex. The problem is the prefrontal cortex is the most susceptible to damage because it is the last part of the brain to myelinate. And so until teens have that capability, until they've had that experience, until they've had that biological construct, they are the most susceptible to basically not being able to engage in analytic thinking. So they are the most easily susceptible to disinformation and propaganda, to which I would argue that, we've been marketing to children inappropriately for years. In fact, 8-year-olds can't tell the difference between the TV show and the TV commercial for that reason. And so, what is the difference between marketing and propaganda? Marketing is using information to espouse your point of view. Propaganda is using disinformation to espouse your point of view. The difference is the truth. And what we've learned from these past 4 years is that nothing on the internet is true. We ultimately are responsible for what's going on in terms of how our teens are faring, because we are not curating the information that's available.
Do you mind if I weigh in, Joanne? Would that be possible?
Yes,
I had some thoughts just because obviously your expertise in the medical field is fascinating. I'd love to talk to you for hours. What's really interesting though is in the media literacy space and in the research around misinformation and disinformation, it's actually the older generation that is doing more sharing of misinformation and disinformation. And there's a lot of evidence that youth are actively engaged in critical thinking around media messages in a way that older people aren't. And so I'm just curious about how that, kind of gels with the biological, because in the evidence that we're seeing in the space of misinformation and disinformation, certainly we're all capable of really being duped, obviously, but there's so much evidence that youth are savvier and are able to step away and not share in a way that older people, especially seniors, aren't. So I don't know if that's a question. I'm just curious about how that kind of gels with the biological.
It actually does gel with the biological. I mean, this is about teen wellness. We could talk about old people wellness too. I was directing my comments primarily to teens, but the fact of the matter is that elderly people have damage to their brains as well, not necessarily in the prefrontal cortex, but in a different area called the hippocampus from chronic stress over the course of a lifetime. And so they also have reasons for glomming on to disinformation for similar reasons. So it actually does fit the biological as well.
So I'd like to pass it on to Kalina to maybe first, Kalina, if you can talk a little bit about what in the film really resonated for you and your experience and your friends and your peers' experience and how your usage and engagement with media affects your mental well-being.
Of course. So once again, my name is Kalina. I'm a senior at High School 1327 in San Anselmo, and I'm actually part of a leadership class at my school known as Peer Resource. And in it, we learn about common teen issues like drug and alcohol use, healthy relationships, eating disorders, stuff like that. And then we work to educate our peers on these issues and be a resource for them, be a support system for them. And so Trust Me was a really interesting complement to some of the concepts that we're tackling in that class. For me, media literacy and confirmation bias definitely were extremely interesting in the film. I often find myself overwhelmed by how much news it seems like there is, how much information is coming to me from the media. And I'm at a time in my life where I'm just starting to form my own opinions on things. And I feel like my perspective is very easily molded by what news I'm being exposed to and what educated members of my community think about certain topics. So I really wish our school had a course on media literacy and how to determine which sources are reliable. And I also would have loved to have been taught earlier how to identify my own confirmation bias and challenge myself to embrace perspectives that differ from my own and make me uncomfortable, because without taking a step back and looking at all of the sides of a concept, you have this tunnel vision, and that just contributes to polarization, especially I think for teens. So for me, I really appreciate that Trust Me brought all of these ideas up.
Kalina, do you want to jump in with a couple of questions from your perspective too?
Yeah. So specifically this year, teens are spending way more time than ever before online with, online homework and Zoom calls. And the amount of time on screen actually had to be increased, which contrasts the kind of anti-screen time movement that I feel like we've seen in the past couple of years. And the film addressed one specific issue that many schools deal with, which is students on their phone in class and at lunch and with their friends. So for anyone on the panel, how is this transition to online learning? How do you think it's developed this issue further? And what is the effect on teenagers' ability to connect with each other in their prime social time of their lives?
I can jump in and just share some thoughts. You know, certainly the pandemic from the beginning, it was really evident almost immediately in our community, in our space, that this was going to fundamentally change the way we relate to each other through technology. And the same tools that we were resisting, and certainly parents were resisting for their children because they weren't connecting, you know, and they wanted them to be more face-to-face, were now the only tools to connect, right? The only tools to socialize were now technology. So from like a parenting standpoint, there is some evidence that parents have started to really think differently about the role that technology should or should not play in their kids' lives, and the value that it can serve, not to eliminate the, you know, the things we need to be careful about, but that there is this value that can be added with technology. There's some really interesting studies done about that, you know, thank goodness that they're able to FaceTime their friends right now. So I think that's a really interesting shift in thinking about these technology tools as not things that are just disconnecting us, but actually have the ability to connect us, is really something that I think we're going to hear a lot about as we think about the pandemic. And I just want to make a point about screen time. You know, I think that there are tons of conversations around screen time, and I totally understand that, but the concept of screen time is actually in our space a little bit outdated, in the sense that what matters more is content and context, and not all screen time is equal. And I would say that the doctor here would probably agree that there's different kind of content that will make your body react in different ways. And so that matters. And so does context a little bit more than just time. So I don't know if that answers, you know, hopefully part of your question, and I'll let everyone else talk about the other parts.
Well, I'm gonna jump in a slightly different way.
Sure.
There's a difference between connectivity and connection. A very big difference, in fact. Connection is eye to eye, face to face. You read the information in the other person's face. Paul Ehrlich, famous psychologist from UC Berkeley, went to Papua New Guinea back in the 1960s, met the indigenous tribes there, had never seen a white person, but they all had the exact same facial expressions for the same emotions. And so they could read, even though they didn't have language, or, you know, not our language, they could read the facial expressions, because the connection, the face-to-face, the eye-to-eye is what's important. There's a set of neurons in the back of your head called mirror neurons. And what they are doing is they are reading the facial expressions of the person you're talking to in real time and transducing those into a neurochemical called serotonin, which is your contentment or your happiness neurotransmitter. The fact of the matter is that by doing this online that we're doing right now, we are connecting in the digital space, but we are not connecting in the human space. So we are actually deficient in serotonin, which unfortunately helps drive this anger, the high dopamine, the high cortisol, and actually makes the problem of the stress response worse, because the serotonin would normally knock that down. And we're actually losing that in the process of doing this online. So, you know, it's not the same, even though we can transmit information through the internet online, we can transmit emotion the same way that we did before.
Can I jump in, Kalina? I have a quick question for you about the film. And just before I get there, I want to mention, Robert, what you and Michelle are talking about. I hope that there's a qualitative difference in terms of the media we consume online, because I make movies, and I hope that the movies are better quality than some of the junk people do end up consuming their days with. But Kalina, I wanted to ask you, the section in the film that is specifically about the media literacy program, where we filmed inside the schools, and that's the segment where you do see kids on their phones a lot. How did you experience that when you were watching it? And I'll preface it by saying that when we showed the film to people before it was finished, it was people in a specific demographic, like age 15 to about 22, who sort of, that section, they thought there was something about it that bothered them. And I want to know how that felt for you. Was there something, was it too close to home? Was it accusatory? You know, how did you and your peers feel when you saw that section of the film?
Well, that's interesting. I think the images of students on their phones in class and while they're talking to their friends, I think that didn't really bother me, because that's so what I'm used to. I've seen that all the time. I see that when we were at school, and I've seen that now with online school. I feel like students are even more on their phones. They're pretty much on their phones during their entire class, because now they can just have their phones here and they can have the screen at the same time. And I think sometimes when I'll hang out with my friends, I feel like everyone's just on their separate phones. And one of the images that really stuck out to me from the film was these students at lunch talking to each other, or kind of talking to each other. They were like in a circle, but they were all on their own devices, which is really interesting. And I completely related to that, because I see that all of the time. And you really have to actively, as a teenager, I feel like you have to actively work against that. And you have to actively try to talk face to face and connect with your peers, because it's so natural now for students to just go on their phones when there's a lapse in conversation, or when they're bored, or when they have nothing else to do. I feel like it's just like, it's the addiction, I think, is just immediately going back to their phones. So I think that part of the film, it didn't bother me, because it bothers me because it's not a good thing, but it didn't feel like something that I'm not experiencing, if that makes sense.
Is there a conversation happening with you amongst your peers about the need to be in a group without looking at your phones, for example? Or is that conversation not quite at the surface yet?
I think it definitely is. I think whenever we go out and actually do something new, or go to dinner, we'll try to put our phones away or whatever. But I think when you're just around other people, it's super natural to just go on your phones. And then once one person goes on their phone, someone else will go on their phone, someone else will go on their phone. And then all of a sudden, everyone's on their separate devices. And so I think there's definitely starting to be a conversation. Teachers are trying to limit phone use for sure. You'll put your phones in a box at the beginning or something like that. So the conversation's there, but it's just the fact that it's now like a natural instinct to just go onto your phone. I think that's what seems dangerous to me. So
I was just gonna say though, that just to cut your generation some slack, is you're not describing teens, you're describing human beings today. And I think it's really important that when we frame this, I know this is a teen wellness, conversation, but, I think that sometimes we forget how new these tools are. I think we forget that we as human beings have only been interacting with social media for 15 years, 20 years. And so I think there's some things that we don't, I think there's a lot of reflection being done by your age group, which I think is amazing. I know my son is 18 and he is essentially off social media. He's like, I'm taking a break. I won't want this anymore. And I think that's really amazing. And so I do think that there's something to be said about how new these tools are, and how the behavior you're talking about with being distracted, with having your phone near you, all of that, that's not a teen issue. That is,
all of us.
Anyone, has that issue. So I think we could learn a lot from each other in that way.
I couldn't agree more. I totally agree. This is not a teen issue. It's a human issue. Sherry Turkle, media watcher at MIT, famously, called this alone together.
Yeah.
The fact of the matter is, people are lonely. Despite the connectivity, there is lack of connection. People are alone together. They're alone on their phones. And the fact of the matter is that loneliness, by depleting serotonin, is causing a significant increase in the rate of depression around the world. There's been a global increase in depression by 18.5% since the advent of the iPhone in 2007. And you can actually see, in terms of the rates of suicide in teens in the United States, a very significant uptick that occurred at 2007 in the 10 to 14-year-old age group, and then the 14 to 19-year-old age group. So, there is very clear evidence that what's happening is you are actually starved for humanity.
I think, though, that there are the argument that that it's only the devices and only the social media. I think the studies are a little bit thin there. There's a lot of other stuff. Like, I would argue that the access that these tools are giving to actual news media and the news media itself is an enormous reason that there's a rise of depression. It's not just these tools, it's what they're watching through these tools. And that's where media literacy comes in, is that the access and the way that our news systems have become so polarized and so dark and so violent, that is impacting our psyches in a way. And I also think that there's something to be said about, this idea that, like, we specifically as human beings have created these devices that do everything for us. So I have this video that I show in my class where it's a desk from the 1980s, and you have a typewriter, and you have a calendar, and you have a telephone, and you have a camera, and you have all of these things. And now we've put everything on this device. So the idea that we're surprised that we're always on it is kind of shocking to me. Like, this is my grocery list. It's my camera. It's the way that I check my heartbeat. Like, it does everything for me. So I think that there's also bigger conversations about the tech, the way that the tech is designed, and, encouraging people to, like, you can still buy a notebook. Like, you can still buy a notebook, people. But I do think that there's a lot to be, I just don't want to forget the content question. Like, the content it matters so much. And our media systems are, there's a lot of things that we need to look at that are not just about the amount of time or the addictive nature of the device. It's what are we seeing every day?
Well, and if we can, I was just say, if we can address the content issue a little bit too, and talk about, just because there's so much in Roko's film about that the misinformation and how we process it, and I'm curious, particularly, Kalina, from your perspective on how it's something that we didn't experience growing up, as far as having that level of access to information on a nonstop basis, and it being so, as Michelle said, violent even and overwhelming. How are you processing, and where do you feel like you need help in figuring that out? Because I'm also curious, this is the next level conversation, but of the roles of schools and educators and parents, and where we all fit in together on how we tackle that.
Well, going back to the news thing, I definitely think seeing the news online is a huge stressor for teens. I think climate change, school shootings, political unrest, obviously the coronavirus. I think the polarization of political parties and the kind of us versus them mentality, I think all of that is hitting teenagers extra hard, because it's all stuff that's going to impact our futures, and we're feeling all of it really directly. And so for issues like that, it's, especially recently, it's been hard for me to find outlets to kind of take away some of the overwhelming feeling that's coming to me. But definitely talking to people in person if I can, or talking to my teachers has helped me. I have a government class where pretty much every day we would go over current events, and we would talk it out with the class and have discussions on it. And I think for me, talking to people in my community who are feeling these same things is what really helps me feel like I'm not alone in feeling the anxiety of these of the news and everything. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but That's just a little insight.
Well, there's the content that's online that you have no control over. And then there's the content that your generation does have control over. It's called cyberbullying. That's not being placed there by Facebook. That's there being placed by your peers. And the problem is, of course, that that's driving cortisol like crazy, and it's driving dopamine like crazy for the person who's posting it. And unfortunately, a lot of it ends up being anonymous too, which is even more of a problem. And again, it goes to this issue of curation. Anyone can put anything on, and the problem is that teens in particular are most susceptible. You don't see a lot of cyberbullying going on in adulthood, but in teens it's particularly problematic. And we're not going to solve this problem just by monitoring the content of what's available through your newsfeed.
I just want to push back on the not cyberbullying with adults. Look what just happened at the Capitol. Like the level of anger that is going up in the political environment online right now with adults. I feel like we could learn a lot from these younger people who, the one thing that there has been an incredible amount of digital citizenship work done in schools. And if you talk to students, you guys are aware of things like digital footprint. You're aware of these things in a way that, those adults that went to the Capitol and were recording themselves, oh my gosh, so I think that, again, I don't think cyberbullying is an issue of young people. I think it's an issue of the time that we're in. And I don't know. I just want to, I don't know.
We're clearly all susceptible, Michelle. You're absolutely right. And there is no demographic that avoids being susceptible to the dark sides and also to the benefits of this technology. And, there's a gentleman we interviewed for our film named Neuroendocrinologist, and he wrote a book called Hooked. And it's about basically using your propensity to get addicted to things, but using it in a positive way. In other words, building positive habits. And he said something that really resonated with me. He said, if you don't want to eat too much candy every day, don't have a bowl of M&Ms sitting on your counter in the kitchen. And it's that exact example. Like when I have M&Ms in the house, I mow through them. If I don't have them in the house, once in a while, I wish I did. And usually I don't think about it. And I eat a lot fewer M&Ms that day. So there are ways to build positive habits. And I think that sort of gets at one of the essential teachings of media literacy is that there are ways to use this constructively, positively, and to mitigate your exposure to things that take you down a dark rabbit hole that lead you to the Capitol, doing things that you shouldn't have done. And those tools are out there. The foundation that funded this film is called the Getting Better Foundation. And one of the principal goals is to make aware to people that the world is actually getting better for most people in most places. It doesn't feel like that at all. But when you think about what would your life be like if you were alive 200 years ago, you could be the king of France and you wouldn't have air conditioning, you wouldn't have modern medicine, you wouldn't have all of these things that we take for granted every day, just because we're born when we are, just because progress has actually happened, just because people do cooperate and do innovate and do things that make the world better. And that's something that's just not at all in it's not in our direct line of sight when we look at the news every day, because the news's job, and I didn't know this till I made the film, but one of the jobs of the news is to point out things that we want to improve. That's part of the job. And part of the reason why people pay attention to stories that are about plane crashes or car accidents or crime is because those are things we don't want. We want to fix those. And the only way to fix them is to know about them. And so I didn't realize that there's this sort of inherent bias in what the media has always done, at least journalism has always done. It's always pointed us to the problems, not because they reflect the average citizen's life, but because those are issues that we want to tackle. whether it's racism, crime, injustice, anything. And so it can feel like, especially if you don't know that, it can feel like, oh, the world is just going to hell. We started our film with that, with a montage of this, if you just open the news every day, to me, though, what the news does is it reminds me every single day how fortunate I am, how fortunate most people I know are, and how I have an obligation, a moral obligation as a citizen of the world to help, because I'm not suffering the way people are suffering in the news every day. And I have an obligation to do something about it.
And I totally agree. The difference is that now that news is targeted to individuals rather than blanket. So the surgical precision with which these AI programs can actually read you, know who you are, like what happened with Cambridge Analytica back in 2016, knowing who was susceptible to this kind of information. Well, guess what? We also now know, they know who's susceptible to this kind of disinformation. And so it's easier to basically blow people up, rather than doing blanket propaganda. They can do it individualized, which makes it even more stealthy and more difficult to be able to control.
I think the news is also, just to echo some of your sentiments, Roko, is that the news is news because it's special. It doesn't happen all the time, right? You don't hear about the 410 representatives that aren't corrupt. You hear about the 6 that are. And so you start to build this narrative that all politicians are corrupt, because non-corrupt politicians are not news. You hear about, and I would argue that the attention news has given to things like cyberbullying or pedophilia or these horrible things have now driven parents, we're in this cycle, have driven parents to be afraid for their children. That makes them believe that being close to home is better. And therefore adults are actually driving the social species of teens onto their phones, because gathering of, like, I live in New York City. You see a group of teens, 5 minutes later, you're going to see police officers, because that group of teens, that's a problem's going to happen, right? What message is that saying? And then we say scatter, and then we're annoyed when you get on your phones to talk to each other, right? Like, we have created this pattern. We're afraid for kids because it's, the world is not safe, but we're, like Roko said, the world is safer than it's ever been, but our news systems is so loud and so robust, and all we hear is the bad stuff. All we hear is the bad stuff. You don't hear about the stories. You hear about the stories of a cyberbullying suicide. You don't hear about the thousands and thousands of students who are working on social justice movements or art projects or, kindness campaigns. Like, kindness campaigns don't get news time. Only the cyberbullying gets news time. And we need to be conscious of that. And we need to find that. We need to figure out how to use those tools to find the good so that we have a more balanced picture of it.
To Roko's point earlier, I was just going to say, to Roko's point, there are a lot of films that do, I think that film actually does a better job of addressing, the content than what you see in Small Bites. Sorry, go ahead, Roko.
Kalina, I wanted to know, what do you and your friends feel like you need or want from parents regarding media and access? Do you want more regulation at the level of the companies, so that you're not seeing this stuff? Do you want more freedom from your parents so you can do whatever you want? What is it that you guys are craving?
That's interesting. Well, for me, I honestly think that this is not really, well, I guess it could be parents as well, but just the communication, like the conversation for me is what's most helpful, talking with other people and about these things and really figuring out, okay, what's just in my head, me being anxious about, and what is a genuine problem that we need to address or whatever. I think that definitely, as far as social media sites go, I think they're getting better at putting in some regulations or where you can report certain posts or whatever for a bunch of different issues. But I think one huge one is negative body image online. And I think that's something that I would love to have more regulation on. I'm not sure exactly how that would work, but That's what a lot of my friends, that's one of the main issues they have with social media and online social media platforms and stuff like that. So maybe regulations as far as that goes. But honestly, for me, I think having open conversations with my parents and educators and peers is what helps me really get my thoughts straight and realize what's real and what's just in my head, if that makes sense.
That's encouraging, because that's doable.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we can talk. Where people are, if we're good at one thing, it's talking. Mm-hmm. And you know, people, we're social creatures too, so that's perfect. You know, we can do that. You know, Michelle is at the forefront of one of the organizations spreading that conversation around the country and around the world. You know, Dr. Lustig with his research is adding, you know, facets of information that we wouldn't otherwise know. So that, I feel encouraged by what you said, Kalina, because if our film can be part of that conversation, I want it to. And know, by the way, everybody on this panel should know that that nobody would be refused viewership of this film for money. In other words, if you can't afford it, don't worry about it. We'll figure out a way to get it to you. It's, I think, reasonably priced regardless. And yeah, we just want to have that conversation, Kalina. So I'm happy to hear you say that.
So just, we're running out of time. So just if we could actually continue on this positive note for a quick wrap up of just sort of one positive, one recommendation or suggestion that is tangible, as Kalina just stated, of how, particularly for our audience of, you know, parents, students, educators, of what you would recommend, you know, to sort of help combat some of the things that we've been talking about and ways to address it that are kind of, you know, easy and straightforward.
Okay, I'll start. And we're going to start with sleep. Something that children don't get. Once upon a time they did, and now they don't, and particularly teenagers, because they have a delayed sleep cycle anyway. Fact of the matter is, if you're charging your cell phone in your room, you are getting 28 minutes less sleep per night than someone who charges their cell phone outside their room. Just from the blue light, never mind from accessing the content. So we are using these technologies in ways that are actually already putting us behind the 8 ball. And lack of sleep leads to higher cortisol, lower serotonin, higher dopamine. There are 5 things that have happened in the last 50 years to drive the prevalence, the increased prevalence of psychiatric disease. They are technology, which we're talking about, processed food, sugar, lack of sleep, and drugs. Let's start with trying to fix the sleep cycle.
Michelle?
I love that you said that about sleep. I use that for my kids' conversations like their whole life. You need your sleep. I would say that, you know, what you were saying, Kalina, just about conversation. I talk to parents and I talk to kids and students all the time, and they have the same concerns. And I don't know why they're not talking to each other. So I would encourage you to sit down and talk to your parents about what they feel when they go on social media. I have body image from, you know, negative body image when I see stuff on social media of what I'm supposed to look like, you know? And so I think there's a lot we can talk about. And then from a media literacy standpoint, we need to make sure schools are taking this seriously, and we need to make sure that teachers get the training and the support they need to bring it into their classrooms. Teachers have a lot on their plates, and so whatever we can do to support them. So I would encourage talking to your principals and your administrators and just saying, like, how can we incorporate more of this, and how can we support our teachers? And on a very basic level, and you knew I was going to do this, Joanne, we are a membership organization and it is free. So get your teachers to sign up at namely.net to become members, and they will get resources and, you know, film. Joanne's California Film Institute is part of our organizational partnership. Getting Better Foundation is. So have them sign up, and so that they have resources available to them to have these conversations in the classroom.
Yeah, just to sort of continue on what Michelle said, there are resources. And that's sort of one of the again, like when I started making this movie, I didn't realize there was people like Michelle who've been doing this for decades, or people like Dr. Lustig who've been studying this. similarly, sometimes when people see our movie for the first time, they think, oh, this is their first exposure to the concept of media literacy. And actually, there's a lot of resources. There are study guides. I don't know if the study guide for our film is complete and available yet. I believe it is. It would be at trustmedocumentary.com. You know, this, I think, NAMLE is a perfect access point. And those conversations to really give context, because I think part of what we were saying is missing on the day-to-day barrage of information is we don't understand what does that mean in the long game, in the long scope. Is the world really collapsing right now? Because it sure feels like it. Well, actually, the world has gone through hardships before, you know, pandemics before, social upheaval before, and we're probably going to get through this. And that just that in itself is a perspective that is not often enough reflected in what we consume every day. And I can imagine as a teenager, you know, when I was a teenager, I was on fire, and like every day was life and death, whether it's a girl that I liked or a friend that, you know, we got in a fight with. There's so much drama inherent in the experience of being a teenager. Having it piled on from the adult world in journalism, it doesn't help necessarily unless you just look at it. Sometimes you can breathe easier if you see that context. And I think that's the kind of thing you can find in these resources. So I hope Kalina, you can help point your teachers and your friends, and I hope we can all do that in a way that is why we're here today.
So Kalina, just to give you the final word too, is there anything else you kind of want to add or address to the adults in the room or to your peers?
I mean, I think what everyone said is really helpful. Resources are awesome. I think as far as the TAM Union High School District goes, I think having wellness as a resource and peer resource as well, those are super helpful. Those are peer resources, a student-led group. So you have your peers that you can talk to. And I think resources like that are the perfect place to start conversations. And I will definitely take some of this to my high school and see what we can do with it and see if we can get some courses on media literacy and stuff like that, because I think that's a really important thing to know in high school for teens. So thank you all so much. This is really helpful for me.
That's awesome. Thank you guys so much for being with us. Thank you all for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
You bet.
Nice to meet you all.
Thanks, Michelle. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.